Hi, welcome to Session 8 of World Revolutions. Today we're going to be looking at probably the second most significant revolution of the 20th century, the Communist Revolution in China during the first half of the 20th century. I say the second most important because I believe most scholars would agree that the Russian Revolution, because of its influence on many other revolutionary movements in the world, including the one in China that we're talking about today, ranks as the most significant. But China certainly has a strong claim to second, if not first place, in part because of the sheer size of China itself at the time of the revolution, counting in the order of 600 million people, now over 1 billion. And in addition to that, the fact that China, of course, is now an emerging world power. But more than that, the Chinese Revolution is significant because of the degree to which Mao Zedong, the leader of the Chinese Communist Revolution, tried to implement broad, sweeping changes in his society, even beyond the scope of those attempted by Stalin and the Bolsheviks in Russia during the Russian Revolution. We will see today that Mao went beyond just trying to transform the economy and social relationships. He really wanted to create a new person. He wanted human beings to develop new values, to act in a different way, to perceive themselves and the world around them in a very different way. So this revolution is certainly in its goals the most pervasive, the most far-reaching, and perhaps the most radical of the 20th century. And in addition, it takes place in a society and in a culture which had an incredible tradition of coherence, survival, of absorption of foreign influences and the transformation of those foreign influences, and yet preservation of the basic culture down through several thousand years. So for a radical revolution to take place in this particular society was all the more striking and all the more amazing to people in the first half of the 20th century as these events unfolded. And to understand just how conservative, if you will, China was in terms of its conserving its own culture, its own values, its own language over several thousand years, we need to look at that history, both to understand that relatively distinctive characteristic of China, but also to look at some of the forces that were undermining that stability of Chinese culture and Chinese civilization over a period of several hundred years and help lead to finally the revolution that breaks out during the first half of the 20th century. And starting here with some of these ideas, I want to give you a general set of concepts about China and what it was like. This isn't a detailed historical narrative. It's a little hard to do that, given how long Chinese history is in the sense of organized societies. In fact, I start with the expression, the 3,000-year empire. That's a bit of an exaggeration. Historians would say, really, that as an empire, China has existed for about 2,000 years. But actually, we can trace back a variety of highly organized and centralized societies for another 1,000 years beyond that. So this is a society that has an incredibly long history. You really can't find another human society that has this kind of continuous historical record. Everywhere else, there are radical breaks with the past. We look at the Middle East or Europe, India, the Western Hemisphere, Europe. We do not see this kind of consistency of preservation of a continuing set of themes and ideas within a culture, of a series of fairly consistent and contiguous centralized political administrations stretching over several thousand years. So China is really distinctive in that regard. Another distinctive feature of China, particularly during the age of empire, during the past 2,000 years up to the time of the revolution, was a governing principle known as the mandate of heaven. This principle, which was essentially instituted by the Han Dynasty, only the second dynasty to rule China as an empire, essentially established this idea that the Chinese emperor, like any ruler during the past several thousand years up until the recent modern period, enjoys the sanction, the support of some divine entity. In other words, he has a God-given right to rule. However, that right is not perpetual. In other words, it doesn't necessarily last forever. no matter what dynasty we're talking about, what ruling family, that dynasty only has a right to continue to rule, only enjoys this divine approval, this mandate of heaven, as long as events indicate within the empire that that mandate exists. And how would we tell that those events indicate that a mandate exists? Because things are going well. The empire is being successfully defended from outside forces. There is reasonable degree of prosperity and internal stability. If these factors should change, if foreign invaders should succeed in seizing territories, if famine should sweep the land, if the economy should suffer, then whatever dynasty is ruling has obviously lost the mandate of heaven. And therefore, some other dynasty, some other family is going to have to seize power and institute a new reign. And indeed, this happened periodically throughout China's history, that as a dynasty encountered serious problems in ruling the empire, it would be challenged on the grounds that it had lost the mandate of heaven and must be supplanted by some other family that was challenging it for rule. At the same time, there's another significance to the mandate of heaven beyond the fact that it provides a principle by which dynastic rule can change. It also suggested the responsibility which the emperor had for the well-being of his society. This was a principle that was not necessarily well understood or practiced in global societies at this time, and we're talking over the last couple of thousand years, that it isn't just a matter of exercise of power, but that the dynasty has a responsibility to maintain order and to see to the well-being of the population within its imperial control. And this is something that becomes an enduring principle and endures today, even under communist rule in China today. So much of the historical tradition of China, as we will see, perseveres right through the revolution and still offers us insight into the characteristics of the current administration of China under communist rule. Another distinctive feature of the empire and of Chinese civilization was the fact that there was more or less an official philosophy, if not religion. Now, the Chinese are known to be eclectic in their religious practices. In other words, there are a variety of religious beliefs that Chinese people have adhered to. And people often adhere to several different religious practices and beliefs at the same time. You can visit a temple in China and discover that, well, gee, there are gods from several different religions in the same temple. There's a very pragmatic approach to that. Buddhism, Taoism, and a variety of other religions have prospered over the centuries in China. But at the same time, through much of its history, Confucianism, the writings of the philosopher Confucius, who lived around 500 years before Christ was born, the writings of Confucius, or at least the writings of his disciples, because that's what we have. We don't have the original writings of Confucius himself, but what was recorded by his disciples and carried on down and eventually put into writing. These principles came to be the dominant philosophy of succeeding dynastic administrations in China. Now, the reason why they would adopt a specific philosophical viewpoint is because the writings of Confucius, or the ideas of Confucius, are very much focused on the idea of order in society and hierarchy. Confucius doesn't spend a lot of time talking about individual experiences. This is not the kind of, feel-good philosophy of the late 20th and early 21st century. I want to get in touch with my own feelings. That's why I'm studying, Taoism or something. This is a philosophy that is more a social philosophy that tells you this is what your responsibility is as a member of the nobility, of the landowning class. And as a peasant or a craftsman, these are your responsibilities. And here is how people should deal with each other on a day-to-day basis. And here is what we owe respect to, in terms of we owe respect to our social betters, and certainly we owe respect to our elders and to our fathers and forefathers. So it's a philosophy about how society should function, and in one that stresses obedience, fealty, loyalty, respect for the instruments and institutions of government. So naturally, a series of dynastic rulers find this a very convenient philosophy to adopt. Another aspect of the rule of China is the examination system. And this was one of the features, particularly by 900 AD, let us say. It had been evolving for some time, but particularly by then, by 900 AD, the examination system has become pervasive in China. And what it is essentially a version of a civil service system. Young people, males, women were not allowed to be part of this process, would spend much of their early life, perhaps into their 30s, studying the classical works of Chinese literature, philosophy, particularly Confucius, and then undergo a series of exams at the local, regional, and finally at the imperial level. If they were successful in passing those exams, they would become part of the imperial administration. They would be known as mandarins. So the mandarins, the successful participants in this examination system, became the official administrators of China. And it gave China a uniform, or as close as you can get to, a uniform bureaucracy. These people, who had come from all different parts of the empire, would be trained in common values and ideas, and then with that common set of values and training, they would be sent out to administer the empire. So long before any other society had a coherent, effective bureaucracy, China had invented one and had one that was working very effectively. This is part of the reason that China does have this long history of one dynasty that succeeds another, a good deal of orderly development, because the central administration is able to manage the empire fairly effectively through this bureaucratic system. We'll see it had another important purpose in a moment or two, but one of the things it does is help centralize, stabilize, and maintain the empire through several thousand years. And we will also see that when the system breaks down over time, it has catastrophic effects for China in terms of China's stability. Another principle of Chinese culture, Chinese society, was what I've referred to here as the peasant ideal. It was believed that the ideal lifestyle in China, although that term really wouldn't exist back then, but the ideal way that one could spend one's life was as a peasant. Why? Because China is, above all else, an agricultural society. What makes possible, ultimately, the great empire and its long history is the fact that China had a peasant society that was capable of producing vast amounts of agricultural products on the lands of China fed by the great rivers like the Yangtze. That is the underlying economic base of the empire down through the centuries. As much as dynasties will change and other aspects of China may change, that is a reality that no emperor, no invader could ever ignore. And therefore, in the minds of Chinese philosophers and the educated classes, the peasant was the most important individual in Chinese society. And the ideal life was to live a life such as that of the peasant that was so productive and supportive of society as a whole. Now, that doesn't mean that peasants were well off. They were still at the bottom of the heap. But the idea was, who is most valued in this society? That's a little bit like talking about American farmers, is the example I always use, that we talk about how important the American family farmer is to our society and so forth. Still doesn't mean that family farmers aren't going to go bankrupt in the end and lose their tractors and their farms, but we still see them as incredibly valuable to our society, both in terms of their economic function and the values that they exercise that guide their lives. And we will see that this too has significance for the revolution, because Mao and the communists will look to the peasants as the ideal society that they are trying to create for all of China. They will go back to the peasants, as we will see, in the midst of fighting their revolution, and draw from the peasants the example of what they think all of society should be like. We'll see how that happens. So at the heart of Chinese society, whatever dynasties came and went, was the peasant proprietor. The peasant who held a small piece of land and worked it for subsistence purposes, and of course, from the viewpoint of the empire, paid his taxes, his tributes that made it possible for the empire to expand and become great. Now, over time, another important aspect of this is the peasant proprietor's status and position and well-being varies significantly over time. It is not a consistent pattern, but there are centuries when proprietors tend to have control of most of the land. Most peasants are independent, small producers. And then other times when the land-owning elites tend to get the upper hand, and many peasants lose land and wind up as tenants. Some of the great imperial reforms over the centuries were designed to reverse that process and put land back in the hands of the peasants. This was the ideal to which the empire always ascribed, because it was highly productive and because, of course, it helped maintain stability in the face of China's rising population. But it's important to remember that that kind of ideal, the small peasant proprietor, was not always a reality for many of the people in the countryside. And as we will see, when that reality, in fact, becomes less and less significant, is a time and a condition that will help create the circumstances under which revolution can occur. This imbalance was reflected in the relationship between large landowners and tenants. In other words, large landowners who had great fields to develop and the people who came to work that land for them. When landlords had a lot of tenants available to them, could settle a lot of people on their land to work for them in sharecropping and other types of arrangements, that meant things were bad for peasant proprietors. It meant the small independent peasants were losing their land and being driven into situations where they had to work as tenants for the landlords. So the more that the landlord prospered because he had a large number of tenants available to work his land, the more the indication was that peasants were losing their land and being forced into these circumstances. Now the landowners themselves, the landlords, also known as the gentry. These are people who have large estates, who have among the highest rankings in society in terms of their social, but also their political position. There was a strong relationship between these people and the Mandarin class. Now, technically, what we have are the large landowners out in the countryside, and then we have these imperial bureaucrats who are the centrally trained official administrators of the empire. But there is a strong interconnection between these groups. Over the centuries, many people who are landlords have become landlords by being mandarins. They have used their position to acquire wealth, and particularly landed wealth. At the same time, landlords often support young people studying for the exams so that when these people are successful and become mandarins, they will be supportive of the interests of the landlords. So officially, there's a separation between these two groups. We're supposed to have this entirely objective, separate group called the mandarins, the bureaucrats, and over here, the landlords. But in fact, there's a lot of interconnection between them, with mandarins becoming landlords and landlords often supporting mandarins who go on to become officials in their region and whom, of course, they have a great deal of influence over. So the imperial system of governance actually makes it possible for people to become large landowners, and at the same time, of course, the imperial government maintains and supports the position of the large landowners, whether it's helping them to get irrigation projects completed or sending in the army in the face of peasant revolts. And this is something else that's worth pointing out, that as much as the empire strove for this ideal of the independent peasant proprietor, more often than not, periods of stress were developing either because peasants were losing their land or because taxation on the part of the landlords or on the part of the imperial government grew so heavy that it detonated peasant unrest. So as much as China has this long, consistent history of imperial rule, it is also true that every period of dynastic rule, whichever dynasty we look at, whether it's the Ming, the Han, etc., two ends of the spectrum in terms of chronology, they're all marked by significant peasant unrest at some time in their history. And we will see that that volatility in the countryside is another contributing factor to the revolution when it comes in the 20th century. Another factor that ties China together, besides the formal institutions of empire, And before I mention the clans, I should also mention one other aspect of imperial rule, and that is the conscious and deliberate effort to integrate populations into a single imperial system. The official philosophy of Confucianism, the use of mandarins, but also the development of an official language. That China is one of the first societies to have a single official written language, which it then tries to propagate and spread among the various and distinct groups that are absorbed as the empire expands over the centuries. And in addition to that, China is probably the first society to develop an official history, where succeeding emperors actually had scholars develop an official single uniform history. What was China's past like? Where did we come from? A justification of imperial rule. These factors, along with the use of the mandarins and Confucian philosophy, make it clear that succeeding dynasties, no matter what else they did, were trying to create a single integrated imperial system. Now, they never succeeded entirely. There were always distinct ethnic groups. There were always groups, particularly at the lower levels of society, who spoke distinct languages or dialects. But nevertheless, China is distinctive itself in the extent to which succeeding emperors tried to integrate the society into a single whole. In addition to those official efforts, the clans provide another cohesive factor that holds China together. Extended family is of enormous importance at every level of society and from every perspective of society. Clans operate in effect as almost small governments in their own right. They have members who may be high figures in government. They may have other members who are large landowners down to peasants. You'll see a broad spectrum, a social spectrum within a single clan, which can constitute thousands of people. The idea of a common ancestor, that this group is tied together through that kind of connection, is incredibly powerful and important. The idea of ancestor worship and the fact that they share a common ancestor. And more than that, there are practical issues here. If one needs help in moving up the ladder socially and economically, where do you turn? You turn to clansmen. If you're among the lower orders, peasant, you look towards the better off members of your clan to hopefully assist you in some way, whether it's gaining access to land, dealing with problems with the government, what have you. If you're a member of the elite, a mandarin, a landowner, etc., you look to these lower members of your clan to help support you and provide popular support for you in terms of sheer numbers of people that are backing you and are of assistance to you in your own endeavors, that they give you some political clout. So clan is extremely important, whether we're talking about people at the top or the bottom. It really helps tie society together through a series of vertical identifications within these extended families or clans. Another distinctive feature in China is the secret societies, the White Lotus Society that I mentioned here. Now, officially, you have an emperor who has absolute power until things go wrong. But of course, until, most people agree that things go wrong until there's a successful rebellion, to speak against the emperor, to challenge his rule in any way, to criticize it, would be, a death sentence for you. But many people, in order to try to achieve reform and change in Chinese society down through the centuries, formed and joined these secret societies. Now, sometimes they would take on criminal purposes, but usually the main intent of secret societies was to try to carry out reforms in China, whether at the imperial or at the local level, without confronting the emperor and the strict orders against open challenges to the rule of whatever dynasty existed. So the idea of forming a secret society, of operating in secret cells, existed down through the centuries in China as the way of going about and achieving change. And we will see again, this is a kind of historical characteristic that will emerge again in the Communist Revolution. There are people who have depicted the Communist Party essentially as a modern version of one of these secret societies. Now, As to other groups in society itself, besides landowners, peasants, merchants would be another significant element. Now, it's important not to overstate the fact here, but it is a fact that in China, merchants had a far lower status than did other groups in this society. Merchants were important. China long had important international trade. It would be impossible to imagine China through most of its imperial history as anything but a society with important mercantile activities going on, including at the international level. I mean, even at the time of the Roman Empire, one of the significant trades that the eastern provinces of the Roman Empire engaged in was the gold trade and the silk trade. And they engaged in that trade with China. The great Silk Roads, the early great Silk Roads, traveled from China all the way to the eastern provinces of the Roman Empire, what we would now call the Middle East. So this was clearly a society where mercantile activity, whether at the local, imperial, or international level, was important down through the centuries. But merchants were not viewed with the same respect as other groups in society. Merchants were seen essentially as exploiters. What do? They simply take a product that one person has manufactured, produced, whether it's grain or an artifact of some kind, and add more cost to it by selling it to someone else. So from the perspective of at least official Chinese philosophy, merchants really didn't serve an important and valued function in society, unlike peasants who were the ones who were producing the food that made society possible. So you do have this lower status that merchants suffer from, as compared to if we looked at merchants and their status in societies such as in India or in Europe. Merchants in China do not hold that same status. They certainly have very little access to political power, at least through most of the history of the Chinese Empire. And we will see again, this is significant. This will play an important role in the coming of the revolution. As far as women, women's status can be seen to largely decline down through the centuries of imperial rule. Women were not considered fit to participate in the worship of one's ancestors. That was left to your sons, not your daughters. And that's why sons were considered so important. Property was always transferred through sons. Women were seen largely, well, I won't say this exclusively because there are women of considerable achievement throughout the dynastic periods of Chinese history, but basically their function was seen as that of transferring wealth from one generation to another by having children. You know, how do you ensure that the wealth that you create, that your father has created, is passed on to the next generation because you are going to have a legitimate heir? That's why China developed the philosophy of the chaste widow, that if a woman was widowed, and this was frequently did happen, that you should remain unmarried so that there would be no question of who the legitimate heir to your late husband's fortune was. That there was only one or two, let us say 3 or 4 legitimate sons, and one of them, the oldest, essentially, would be the legitimate heir to the fortune. This was to be the function of women. So women had a very lowly status, relatively speaking, in China. And again, that's not to say that there weren't exceptions, but generally this is what was seen as the appropriate function and purpose of women in society, was a mechanism by which wealth could be passed on. Now, China's history is consistently one of empires trying to protect themselves from outside invasion. Everyone has heard of the Great Wall of China. Well, the reason they built the Great Wall of China and rebuilt it was to try to protect themselves from foreign invaders. And there are a series of such invasions that occur by nomadic peoples coming from the north, from Mongolia, from Manchuria, as I say here, from the Mongols to the Manchus. A consistent function of every imperial dynasty was to try to protect China from those foreign invasions. But inevitably, some of these invasions were successful. When Marco Polo visits China and meets Kublai Khan really is not a Chinese emperor. He's a Mongol. He is one of the successors to the Mongol dynasty that was set up to rule China. So China periodically is overrun by these nomadic people who establish new dynasties. What is striking about these invasions is that when the invaders are successful, inevitably they wind up absorbing much of what is Chinese culture and becoming Chinese. They discover that about the only way to rule China is to do it the way previous emperors and dynastic systems have been doing it. So that, as was said of the Mongols, it's easy to conquer an empire on horseback, but you can't rule it on horseback. In other words, you have to become part of the system. You have to adopt the same ideas. You have to learn about Confucianism. Yes, you still need trained mandarins to run the system. You better learn the language because nobody speaks your language. There is an amazing ability of Chinese culture and civilization over the centuries, over this 2,000 years of empire, to absorb these invaders from the outside and eventually see them become part of the imperial system itself. In fact, the last of the great dynasties was really the Manchus, also known as the Qing. They are the last of the great dynasties that rule China. They will produce the last emperor. And yet they themselves were, again, invaders from the north. They had come from Manchuria and initiated their dynasty in 1644. So even the last of the great imperial dynasties is itself a product of one of these foreign invasions by nomadic people who eventually become absorbed into the system. Now, through these long periods of dynastic rule, foreign invasion, the absorption of foreigners, it became increasingly of concern to succeeding emperors that they indeed assure dynastic succession that was legitimate, meaning that they had to be concerned about the fact that they would have legitimate and capable heirs. One of the ways that they did this was essentially by having a series of wives, first wife, second wife, third wife, all of whom, and there would be many wives, would produce children for you. And out of this group of children, it was assumed, of course, that ultimately a not only legitimate, because they were a legitimate child, but an effective heir would appear. And in fact, Chinese history, the history of the Chinese imperial court, becomes much like the history of Rome, with people conniving and scheming, including the various wives, because each of them is trying to promote the interests of her children. One of them in particular, one male who she hopes will succeed to the imperial throne. So much of imperial history, as the centuries go on, become this power struggle over which of these women, which of the children of these women, is going to succeed to the throne. It wasn't uncommon to knock off a few of your rivals or their children along the way to try to ensure that kind of succession. One of the other practices that is instituted to ensure this system and the legitimacy of the children is the use of eunuchs. In other words, men who had had their genitals removed so that they themselves could not produce children. Therefore, they could be trusted to be around the imperial family and not create situations where there would be illegitimate children. The eunuchs over time took on far more of a role than just being family administrators, and they became key figures in imperial administration itself. The eunuchs were the only ones allowed close to the emperor on a day-to-day basis, and as a result, it's the eunuchs who take on important administrative roles at the imperial level. Over the centuries, this would also create, however, a separation, a growing distance between the larger landed elite and the emperor with his eunuchs. Again, mandarins are still coming from, across Chinese society, being educated, being sent out to the provinces. They are still closely connected to landowners, but the official imperial administration that is going on is increasingly removed from the rest of Chinese society because it consists largely of the emperor, the eunuchs, the imperial wives, and the families contending for power. There is a gap growing in terms of efficient administration and responsiveness between the imperial court and the rest of the country. And we see that especially under the Manchus, the last dynastic order. And the Forbidden City is the place where all of this occurs, of course. See the Forbidden City today in Beijing, and the idea was this was the imperial court, and forbidden meant no one was to go there except the imperial family and the eunuchs. Again, symbolizing this great separation that was occurring between the official family, the dynasty, its retainers or the eunuchs, and the rest of society, including the powerful landowning class and the rest of China. Another problem is official corruption. Again, probably the ideal that there were these officially trained and objective bureaucrats, the mandarins, who served, for example, as judges. They weren't just administrators, they also had judicial functions. That they were separate, objective from the landowning class. That ideal never really existed in the true sense. But the fact is that over time, China moves further and further from that ideal. There was always some connection between mandarins and the landowning class, but more and more as we get into the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, the system is being corrupted, and it is difficult, if not impossible, to achieve truly fair administration of justice in China. And corruption of officials is becoming ever greater down through the centuries. One effect of this that will be particularly important is that peasants truly are losing this ages-long struggle over retaining their land and retaining some sense of independence compared to the interests of large landowners. More and more the scales are being tipped in favor of the large landowners who are able to corrupt and influence the mandarin class more and more effectively over the centuries. And less is the mandarin class really a distinct and independent group. We see also, as a part of this process, the decline of the examination system, in the sense that it is no longer this tightly administered, careful, and effective means of testing people, finding the most efficient and effective people to run the empire, those who will be truly objective. You can now buy your way by the 18th and 19th centuries into imperial administration. And that means, again, a loss of objectivity, greater openness to corruption than ever before. So the system is clearly in decline through these centuries. Among the problems that afflict China by the time of the Manchus and their rule is large population, first of all. These figures give you some idea of the population in these periods, with 430 million in 1850, 600 million in 1950. And when you think that China had experienced, as we will see, massive internal conflicts, invaded by Japan in 1931, an ongoing war between the communists, the nationalists, who we'll talk about, and the Japanese, really from 1931, then the defeat of the Japanese in 1945, and then continuing struggle between the communists and the nationalists down to 1950. You've got about 20 years of uninterrupted warfare sweeping China, killing millions of people, if not in actual combat, then as a result of mass famine and deprivation. Despite all of those losses, still the population is growing at a phenomenal rate, putting increased pressure on the society to produce sufficient economic means to support this population, particularly agricultural products. And increasingly we have a regime that is affected by corruption, where the imperial family is distanced from the larger society as a whole, and as a result we see an increasingly weakened and enfeebled administration, failing to address the needs of the population. And if the state is not effective in providing irrigation systems, in providing storage systems for grain that it had done down through the centuries, this was a central role of the imperial system down through the centuries, was to manage the vast irrigation systems that made China's agriculture possible, and to store grain so it would be available in times of shortage. Increasingly, as the dynasty is unable to do that effectively and efficiently, these demographic pressures are building up, and famine and vast loss of life is becoming ever more frequent in China. the rapid spread of diseases and plagues, because people are so often living right at the edge of starvation. So these conditions combined, growth in population, decline in government efficiency, are creating a crisis, particularly in the countryside in China, and especially as we enter the 19th century, we see China as an impoverished society racked by famine and disease. Another aspect of this is peasant poverty, that at least 50% of peasants are without sufficient land to support themselves by the 19th century. Now, what were the percentages in earlier centuries? We can't be sure, but it's pretty clear that far more, an overwhelming majority of peasants in earlier centuries would have enjoyed access to their own land in most periods of dynastic rule. So there has been a serious deterioration in the position of peasants. And the more of them that have to work as tenants, the more of them that are essentially working at the level of poverty at near starvation. And of course, in times when the economy is in bad shape, tenants can be thrown off the land, they can be left to wander the roadways of rural China and starve to death. At least those who have some access to land have the ability to at least maintain their own subsistence by growing their own crops. Another aspect of this is the tie of land to clan and religion. There is an intimate link between these ideas. Villages frequently represented a clan, an extended family, and one's role and participation in the clan depended upon the fact that you did indeed own land itself. Without that, you were not considered to be an active participant in the clan. And of course, that also meant you could not participate in the special ceremonies meant to honor and worship one's ancestors. So loss of land not only put you at risk of starvation, but even if you managed to survive as a tenant, the fact is you were now being deprived of these special social familial linkages that gave so much of your life meaning. So this is a crisis that goes beyond just, well, it's not just a matter of, well, gee, I'm unemployed and I'm looking for some work and I'm kind of falling on tough times. I'm actually being isolated from those kinds of links that are so important to me, specifically my extended family, because I no longer have land. So this is a crisis that has social and psychic implications far beyond just its economic implications for peasants in the 19th century. And it helps explain, in part, the great turmoil that will sweep China in the 19th century, as we will see, and indeed in the 20th century. Why were so many people willing to take up arms? And not just in the Communist Revolution, as we'll see in a moment, but in the 19th century as well, that millions upon millions of people would rise up in mass rebellions. Something drastic has to be happening in Chinese society for these people to do this. Yes, there have been peasant rebellions before, but never on the order of what we will see in the 19th and early 20th century. So something has to be happening that's undermining this overall characteristic of stability that had marked the Chinese imperial system down through the centuries. And it is here that we see people becoming not only impoverished, but really being alienated, being disassociated from those ties of family and religion that normally tie them to society and keep them relatively quiescent even in hard times economically. Hard times economically in and of themselves do not always spur people to violent upheaval. Because they have other linkages. I'm concerned about my family. I don't want to risk losing my family if I go out and rebel against the government. But if you feel like you're losing your family anyways, your ties to your family, to religion, no matter what you do, even if you sit and do nothing, then the impetus to rebel becomes all that much greater. And that's what's happening in China in this period. The burdens of tenancy are precisely what we're talking about here, that even if you gain access to use of land as a tenant, nevertheless you are deprived of these other connections. And furthermore, you are ever more subject to exploitation. It isn't just government taxes that may be high, but the landlord, as he sees more and more peasants losing land and unable to access land, is going to be even harsher in his demands upon those peasants. You'll be working that much harder, paying that much more out of the crops that you produce from the land as a tenant. So the conditions of tenants are rapidly worsening because, of course, landlords know they can take advantage of this huge amount of surplus labor that exists in the countryside. And finally, there is this failure of the government to maintain the granary system, the series of storage houses that were designed to maintain stability in the rural sectors of China down through the centuries. One of the greatest threats was always famine, that a crop failure in a particular part of China would lead to mass rebellion because of the threat of starvation. So food was kept in storage houses, grain was kept there, to overcome these periodic failures so that grain and food could be provided to people at the time of greatest need. That system in the 19th century is collapsing. There is no backup system. That social safety network that had helped China persevere and survive as an empire for so long was disintegrating and further fueling this unrest in the countryside. Now, as all of these problems are falling upon the shoulders of the Chinese people, there comes a new wave of barbarian invasion. Only these people are not coming from the north. They're coming from the east. They're coming from Europe. European encounters with China will have a profound effect upon China's history and development. Now, European encounters with the Chinese begin not long after the discovery of the New World by Columbus. But China, through its history, has tended to fend off close contact with groups from outside the empire. And that was certainly true of its linkages to Europeans. Now, over the centuries, the relationship varied. Some dynasties were more inclined to open China up to some degree of contact, economic interchange, cultural missions, whereas other rulers would tend to limit those type of interactions. But generally, China was not anxious to open itself up to great and extended contacts with Europeans, or for that matter, other groups. The belief, particularly under the Ming, who preceded the Manchus, was that China was, the celestial empire. It was the perfect society and had little need of the values and ideas and products of other civilizations. However, the truth was that by the end of the Ming Dynasty, while the Ming had managed to preserve much of what was China, they had failed to innovate. And China was rapidly falling behind other civilizations, and particularly those in Europe, in terms of many of its accomplishments. Its productive technology, the ideas of industrialization, etc., its technology for warfare, its administrative system, and certainly by the 17th and 18th centuries, is falling behind what exists elsewhere in the world. The Mandarin system was a fantastic innovation that made China far more effectively administered than any other human society at the time. But by the 18th and 19th centuries, other societies, particularly in Europe, are moving towards the concept of specialization, that bureaucrats are specialized individuals. You're not just a trained bureaucrat in general. And that's what Mandarins were. I mean, Mandarins had a common set of trainings that they received, but then they went out and fulfilled a variety of different functions. They could be a judge. They may also work organizing military forces for the emperor in a particular region. They essentially have budgetary, tax collecting functions, all kinds of different jobs. But in more modern societies, those jobs are being specialized. You have people who specifically, these are the professional soldiers over here. These are the budget people over here. So we have specialization of function. That's not happening in China. So in many ways, China is becoming less efficient in compared to other societies. And this is going to cost dearly in the later encounters with the Europeans. The most striking of these encounters comes in the 19th century as a result of a problem that the British had. The British are, of course, one of the great imperial powers of the 19th century, and their most important imperial holding is India. And it is from India that they derive much of their wealth. But they also look towards China as a new opportunity for trade. And indeed, British merchants in the early 19th century are actively courting trade along China's coast. But at this time, in the early 19th century, they are limited to access to one port along the southern coast of China called Canton. And they can only go there during a brief trading season each year. But an even more important problem for the British than just the limitation on when and where they can trade with China is that the trade tends to be highly one-sided. In other words, the British are buying a great deal from the Chinese. The Chinese are not buying a great deal from the British. There is an imbalance of trade. Chinese really aren't interested in cheap British textiles. The British, on the other hand, love tea and are purchasing huge amounts of that and Chinese silks and other products. So Britain is spending a lot of its treasure to buy products from China. It has a trade imbalance. It needs to rectify that imbalance. It needs to find a way to get the Chinese to buy more products from the British. The solution in the end is opium. Opium is grown in northern provinces of what was then the colony of India, and the British want to sell it in China. China has had a long history of problems with drug trade and with the use of drugs, particularly opium. The Chinese emperor is not anxious to open up trade in opium and exacerbate the problems he already has in terms of addiction of a portion of the population to opium. On the other hand, the British are insistent that that is going to happen because this is a product they know that there is a demand for. It's like selling cigarettes. If you're addicted, what can you say? You're going to buy them. As a result of this impasse, the British finally go to war against China in 1839, what was known as the Opium War. It's a relatively limited military engagement, mostly a matter of British warships destroying portions of the Chinese Navy and sailing up the rivers of China to launch attacks on several Chinese cities. Finally, unable to resist the military assault from the British, the Chinese emperor essentially surrenders and agrees to sign a treaty which opens up a series of ports in China to British merchants and which essentially cedes for an extended period the port of Hong Kong to the British. This is where the British got Hong Kong from. This is why the Chinese were so anxious to take it back at the end of the 20th century, because they had had to surrender their own national territory to the British as a result of this defeat. But what is more important than the defeat itself, although that is indicative of China's weakness at this point, its inability to defend its own territories, more importantly was the vast expansion of trade that now occurs between the British and the Chinese, soon to be followed by other Europeans. The French, the Germans, the Russians will all come looking for trade opportunities. Now, again, China was not new to international trade or to trade with people from Europe. Some of this had been going on for centuries. And things like the peanut and the potato wound up in China because of trade with Westerners. Now, those products came from the Western Hemisphere. They got to China as a result of European trade. But this new era has a profound effect upon China's stability in several ways. First of all, it accelerates the process of commercialization of agriculture, at least near the coast, where the large port cities are. Now there are increasing opportunities for people to specialize in the growing of certain particular products. Let's say you want to take up silk farming. So you're a peasant, instead of growing several different types of food products to support yourself, being sure that if one product fails, there'll be another growing and you'll be able to have enough food for next year. Now you're going to specialize in something which really isn't meant for your own consumption. You're just producing it to sell somewhere else, particularly to sell to Westerners. Again, this is a process that had existed for centuries in China, but it's being accelerated, particularly in the southern parts of China, those areas near the great port cities in the south. Another influence is the rise of a group of merchants who are the go-betweens between the domestic Chinese economy and British and other traders, people called compradores, partners, as they would be known. These middlemen, these merchants, are becoming incredibly wealthy during the 19th century as a result of this growing international trade. And by the end of the 19th century, they are looking for a comparable political role, a political role comparable to the economic influence and power that they have been achieving. This represents a serious challenge to the old order. In China, mandarins, landowners, these are the people that exercised political authority for the past 2,000 years. Merchants had essentially no role in this very traditional system. Now, merchants are beginning to clamor for change, and their growing importance in the economic system means that they have a significant voice that needs to be heard. This is another factor destabilizing China. We have the weakening of the government internally. We have growing problems in agriculture in terms of number of peasants who have land, their sense of alienation for those who do not, problems of famine and disease. And now, within the elite itself, if we could count merchants as a part of the elite, there is this conflict because the merchants now want access to political power and to social status that they have been denied in the past. And in addition to that, of course, we have the increased commercialization of agriculture, which means that there is a growing group of well-to-do peasants who have benefited from commercial agriculture, while many of their brothers in the same villages have fallen behind because they have been unsuccessful in those same types of enterprises. So the entrance of the British as a result of the Opium War and of other Europeans has profound effects, changing much of the face of rural agriculture in southern China near the port cities. This is not universal, and setting off this dispute within the upper reaches of Chinese society over the power of merchants and their influence. So we see that the forces of capitalism have a profound effect on what is happening in China in the 19th century. They are bringing changes. Not that China didn't already suffer from problems. It's not like, well, the Europeans came and brought, increased incentives for capitalism, that caused all the problems. China already had problems. But now, these new barbarians are not going to simply be absorbed into Chinese civilization. They are changing it, and they are setting off new waves of conflict within Chinese society that are going to add to the problems that already exist. Finally, there is the question of the treaty ports. In China, in the latter part of the 19th century, European powers begin asserting their right to control the major seaports of China and even some of the interior cities. These places were known as treaty ports. And in cities like Shanghai and Canton, etc., Europeans would actually establish governments and police forces that would rule significant parts of these cities. Now, China was not technically a colony of any European power, but European powers, including the British and the French and the Germans and the Russians, were establishing areas of China where they essentially controlled those territories. This had a profound effect upon China because China was essentially sacrificing its sovereignty over much of its coastal region, which it was, of course, its most important region in terms of international commerce and in terms of the beginnings of industrialization. And here these huge urban complexes were being taken over and dominated by Europeans. This was an issue that went to the heart of Chinese national character in the sense that people seeing their own society, their empire, subordinated to these foreign powers in this fashion. Finally, there is also the influence of Christian missionaries. One of the other aspects of European penetration is the arrival of thousands of Christian missionaries, but an equal number of somewhat more Protestants than Catholics, but both groups coming several thousand in number to try to convert the Chinese population, seeing hundreds of millions of Chinese that they believed would become Christians in the years ahead. In fact, only a small percentage of China's population ever converted to Christianity, but nevertheless, this is seen as another foreign influence. And of course, one of the disturbing aspects of Christianity for the Chinese is that it does not smile upon the religious eclecticism that the Chinese had exercised for so long. That, well, okay, I worship my ancestors, and I also am a Buddhist, and maybe I've picked up some ideas from Taoism, etc. It's all very practical to me. I use those beliefs and practices which seem to work most effectively. That's unacceptable, of course, to Christianity. There is a necessity for conformity. There is one God, there is one set of practices and beliefs that you must adhere to. Furthermore, in the midst of the suffering and anguish in China itself, many people in China would come to see the missionaries and the foreign merchants and the treaty ports as parts of the problem, that these factors were causing the great misery of China. In some ways they were. They were contributing to further disruption, although China's society, its civilization, its administration were in serious decline before the Europeans arrived. But now the activities of Europeans are helping accelerate, exacerbate those problems and creating new problems such as the rise of the compradores. So there is a certain reality to how people in China see this, that the Europeans, the Westerners, are contributing, if not the main cause of their problems in the late 19th century. The 19th century is marked, as I suggested earlier, by some of the most massive peasant uprisings ever witnessed in China. The greatest of them all being the Taiping Rebellion, which runs from 1850 to 1865. It encompasses provinces like Guangdong and Guangxi provinces, as well as Canton in the south. And I'll show you a map in a minute to make this a little bit clearer. Its leader is Hong Chuan, the man who saw himself as the brother of Jesus. Hong was a failed candidate in the examination system. He had wanted to be a Mandarin. He had wanted to rise in the system, but had failed in those efforts. He saw this in part as a sign of the corruption of Chinese society and civilization, including the examination system. He had had some exposure to Christian missionaries and picked up on some ideas of Christianity, although he also incorporated a variety of other religious beliefs in his belief system, including seeing himself, of course, as the brother of Jesus. This is, in many ways, a millenarian movement, a movement that sees itself as ushering in a new age, a new kingdom, and more than that, a new social order. In some ways, it reflects some of the writings of Christianity and Western religions in talking about how the last shall be first and the first shall be last, but that isn't to come sometime at the end of time, in eternity. It's to happen now, that they are going to reorganize society, that they will bring the mighty low, and that they will raise the poor up. So they are calling for a true social revolution. And you can imagine the enormity of the appeal of this kind of idea to millions of peasants in China who were suffering through these enormous distortions that had occurred in China, the decay of the imperial system, of the granary system, famine and plague, the rise of commercial agriculture where disparities in wealth were growing. Here was a promise to right all of those wrongs and to lay the mighty low and bring the poor into power in this world here and now. In doing so, the Taiping rebels rejected Confucianism with its ideas about social hierarchy. Remember, Confucius is so concerned about showing respect for your elders and for the administrators of society, for your social betters. No. We're doing away with all that. And Taoism's ideas about withdrawing into oneself and seeking self-perfection. No. we're going out and we're changing the world. This isn't, again, get in touch with yourself and feel good about yourself. This is go out and revolutionize the world. And we can see some of the ideas of the communist revolution here with the Taiping Revolution in the 19th century. And just for a moment, this map is a little hard to follow, but if they zoom in on it, I think we can at least get a rough idea. If you look here in the central part of China, okay, in this area is where much of, and particularly in this area, is where much of the Taiping Rebellion occurred. Later on, here, these spots here, these striped areas, are where an important part of the Chinese Communist Revolution will occur. And I'll show you exactly what happened there when we get to the rise of the communists themselves. But it's in the same general area. And it's important to note here the port city, not port city, the merchant city of Changsha. Changsha was an important city where merchants traded grain and other products in south-central China. I'm going to come back and talk about that as well in a moment. But this is the general area of the Taiping Rebellion in the 1850s and 60s. It's important to remember that this is the same area that will play a significant role in the coming of the Chinese Revolution. The Taiping Rebellion will eventually muster tens of millions of people in support of its ideas, and the battle to bring the rebellion to an end will cost 20 million lives. Most of them, again, not in combat, but because of the vast disruptions of the agricultural system. As the imperial forces fought to defeat the rebels, and as the rebels attacked territories that were still supportive of the empire. Eventually, the emperor has to essentially leave it to local military officials in the individual provinces in south-central China to carry out the strategies and to engage the resources to defeat the rebels, a sign of the weakness of the empire itself. This is not a centrally commanded army controlled by the emperor that finally defeats the Taiping rebels. It is, in fact, a series of local commanders who, in return for defeating the rebels, demand considerable independence from imperial rule. It is the beginning, if you will, of the system of warlords, of local military rulers, large landowners, who assert their independence from centralized rule. And the emperor, in order to survive, feels he has to give them those kinds of powers and authority, because otherwise he faces defeat and destruction at the hand of the rebels. The local military commanders finally defeat the Taiping rebels, but of course in the process the emperor and the imperial system is further weakened because these individuals, these local commanders, assert greater authority and control over the regions in which they live and the regions in which they rule. So the rebels are defeated while leaving a legacy for the communists, but at the same time the imperial government is severely weakened because now we have the rise of the warlords, local commanders, local landowners, who essentially rule almost independently of imperial government in many ways, paying no more than lip service to imperial rule, only pretending in many ways that they are in fact still the servants of the imperial system. This was not the end of the great rebellions. There is another rebellion following on the heels of the Taiping called the Nian, which is not quite as large but very significant. And then beginning in 1898 and running till 1900, the Boxer Rebellion. The Boxers began as a secret society. They were opposed to both imperial rule and to the influence of foreigners. They were known for their attacks on missions, their attacks on missionaries and foreign merchants, and much like the Taiping rebels, they called for the end of corrupt imperial officials, but added to that their demand for the removal of foreigners from China. And for a time, they laid siege to the imperial capital in Beijing in the north and nearly defeated the imperial forces. One of the decisive factors in their defeat was the arrival of 20,000 troops, Europeans in particular, but also some American forces that play a central role in defeating the Boxers in 1900. But here, between the Taiping Rebellion and the Boxer Rebellion, we see the forces that are sweeping China and shaking the imperial system to its roots. Peasant unrest and rebellion. And what are people longing for? They want a new order. They want an end to injustice. They want land. They want an end to the official corruption. And increasingly, they are turning against the foreigners, whom they see as very much a source of their suffering down through the decades in the 19th century. And again, they're not entirely wrong. Not all of this is the result of foreigners having a greater presence in China, but foreigners have triggered a series of changes which have exacerbated wealth differences in the countryside and, of course, created conflicts among the groups at the top of society with the rise of the compradores. There is another event, far less noticed at this time, in the merchant city of Changsha. Changsha riot, or rebellion in 1910, is an attack by by peasants, on the merchants in Changsha. There have been grain shortages. The peasants accuse the merchants of hoarding grain so that they can sell it internationally and causing starvation in the countryside. There is an uprising in which the merchant houses and the grain warehouses in Changsha are attacked by crowds of peasants. But what is particularly notable is not only do they attack the merchants and their warehouses, they also attack the local Christian missions and the local foreign consulates. So they, like the Boxers, see a connection between their own suffering and the activities of foreigners, as well as the activities of merchants. What is also of great interest is that leading these peasants are a group of local officials, mandarins. The mandarins are making their last desperate effort to fend off these changes which are undermining their authority, the rise of the merchant class, their growing power. So here they make common cause with the peasants against foreigners and merchants, knowing full well that the merchants represent a tremendous threat to their authority within China itself, that the old order is crumbling and being undermined, not only by its own corruption and decay, but by the rise of these new urban groups, the merchants, the compradores, who have new wealth and are now demanding new powers. So we see both of these forces in play, both the anti-foreign factions and the factions opposed to the influence of compradores in the Changsha events of 1910. And again, these events are occurring in the same parts of south-central China that were racked by the Taiping and the Nian rebellions back in the middle of the 19th century. And what's so significant about these areas? They are readily connected by railroads and rivers to the great port cities to the east. This is where commercialization of agriculture is rapidly accelerating in China. Not in all of China, but in these areas in the south-central parts that have good connections to the urban areas on the coast is where commercialization of agriculture is accelerating. These are places where foreign merchants and foreign missionaries can readily make their presence and their influence known. These are the places where change is occurring rapidly. Aside from all of the problems that China has in terms of corruption, inefficiency of government, decline of the examination system, these other influences coming from the outside, bringing rapid change in the countryside in terms of commercialization of agriculture and foreign cultural influences in the form of foreign missionaries. Here in south-central China is where we can see those particularly concentrated at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. And it's not surprising it's in this very same area we will see the rise of the Communist Revolution in the decades after the Changsha Rebellion. There is a logical connection because these influences are there. They helped trigger the Taiping and the Nian rebellions. They will also help trigger the Communist Revolution in the 20th century. So China is a society in turmoil in the late 19th and early 20th century, racked by the greatest peasant uprisings that it had ever witnessed in its history. But as is so often true, the end comes not with a bang, but with a whimper. The old imperial regime essentially collapses in upon itself in a series of military coups with military officers seizing power, and finally the abdication of the last Manchu emperor, who was a mere child at the time of his abdication. In his place, briefly, comes a Western-trained doctor, Sun Yat-sen, who briefly serves as the president of China. Although his impact and his legacy will be long, the truth is he only for a very brief time had any real control over China as its president, because the disintegration of political order was accelerating at such a pace. By 1911, the celestial kingdom is at an end. The last emperor has resigned, and while Sun Yat-sen is struggling to exercise some authority over China, this land of more than 600 million people has in fact fallen into chaos. But there are forces emerging, even at this moment of chaos, on both the nationalist side, as we will call them, and the communist side. And it is these two groups, as we will see in a few minutes, who will struggle for power, with eventually the Chinese communists coming to power. And it is they who will try to follow an agenda to meet the needs of both the Chinese peasants and those who have long been offended by the influence and dominance of foreigners. We will see all of that in the making of the Chinese Revolution in just a few minutes.